Husband pushes wife from plane for insurance money. She survives, and the shocking twist. The beginning of a sinister plot. The air was crisp, and the sunlight flickered through the blades of the helicopter, casting fleeting shadows over the couple below. It was supposed to be a romantic anniversary celebration, a chance for Richard and Sophia to share a beautiful moment together. But what began as a serene helicopter ride quickly spiraled into a nightmare. Sophia, feeling the wind rush against her face, marveled at the breathtaking views below. It had been Richard's idea, a helicopter ride over the sprawling countryside, something they had never done before. He was often busy, preoccupied with his work as a senior claims adjuster at an insurance company. But today, he seemed different, as if he had made an effort to rekindle their love. For the first time in months, she saw a spark of affection in his eyes. As they hovered above the earth, Richard turned to her with a soft smile, though it was quickly overshadowed by something far more sinister. "Look down there, honey," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the helicopter's blades. "See how small everything looks from up here?" Sophia smiled, leaning closer to the window, her face pressed against the cool glass. And then it happened. Richard's hands, once familiar and loving, were suddenly firm and deliberate on her back. He wasn't guiding her gently to safety. He was loosening the safety harness that was supposed to keep her secure. Confusion struck. The door that should have been locked flung open, and before she could even ask, before the words left her mouth, his hands pushed her forward hard. Sophia gasped, her heart pounding as she plummeted into the empty sky below. The last thing she saw was Richard's cold, emotionless smile as he watched her fall, his face growing smaller and smaller as the earth rushed up to meet her. In that moment it was clear, this wasn't an accident. Richard had just murdered her for the insurance money. The life she once knew, the man she once loved, had betrayed her. Her mind raced as she fell through the air, and she thought of all the signs she had missed: the sudden interest in life insurance policies, his late nights at work, the unexplained perfume on his clothes, and the mounting debts they couldn't explain. It had all led up to this moment, her husband trying to kill her to cash in on her life insurance policy. But instead of crashing to the ground, the unthinkable happened. Sophia's fall was broken not by the unforgiving earth, but by a massive oak tree that pierced the air like a sudden, life-saving obstacle. Branch after branch slowed her descent, causing intense pain as her body snapped through the canopy. Her arm fractured with a sickening crack, and her ribs felt like they were collapsing as she hit a thick branch, but she was alive. The pain was overwhelming, but so was the realization that she had survived. The helicopter's roar faded, and she could hear it circling above her. Richard, surely making sure she was dead, but she had no intention of playing the victim. She could feel the blood dripping down her face, but her anger began to overpower the pain. She wouldn't let him get away with this. Sophia stayed still, forcing herself to remain motionless as the helicopter flew away. It had to be convinced she was dead, and as soon as she could move, she would take the first step in her revenge. The realization of betrayal. Sophia's body ached with each breath, but her mind was sharper than ever. She lay still in the pile of leaves, her heart thundering as she tried to take in the surreal situation she found herself in. Richard had betrayed her, pushed her from a helicopter, and left her for dead. But she was alive, and that spark of life carried with it a burning desire for justice, vengeance even. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Every nerve in her body screamed in pain, but she remained still, focused. She knew that if she screamed for help now, Richard might hear her, and the consequences could be disastrous. He was not the man she thought he was anymore. He was a murderer, driven by greed and his desire to start a new life with his mistress. Amanda, the woman who had been working closely with Richard, his secretary, his lover, was part of the plan. Sophia's eyes remained closed as memories of the last few months flooded her mind. The late nights Richard spent working overtime at the insurance company, his sudden interest in increasing both of their life insurance policies, the secretive phone calls he took when he thought she wasn't listening, the strange smells on his clothes that didn't belong to her. It all pointed to one thing: Richard had been planning her death for months. The affair with Amanda was no accident, and it was clear now that the life insurance policy wasn't just for peace of mind. It was for a payout. Her body felt broken, and it was hard to think straight through the pain, but she forced herself to focus. How could he do this to me? She thought. How could I have been so blind? The man she had loved, the man she had supported through thick and thin, The man who had promised to be her partner for life had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. But that betrayal also meant something else. Sophia now had the upper hand. She wasn't dead. The pain in her arm was unbearable, and her ribs felt as if they might puncture her lungs with every breath. Still, she forced herself to move. Slowly, inch by inch, she dragged her broken body across the forest floor, desperate to find help. Her goal was simple: to survive, to make it to safety. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter, and Richard would regret ever thinking he could get away with this. 2 long hours later, as she could barely keep her eyes open, she saw a faint light in the distance. The smell of wood burning in a chimney reached her nose. It was a farmhouse, small, tucked away in the woods. Every part of her wanted to collapse and give in to the exhaustion, but she refused. The fire in her chest burned brighter than any of her injuries. She would find a way out of this. She would make sure Richard paid for what he had done. The old couple who lived in the farmhouse took one look at Sophia and knew she was in trouble. They quickly called 911, and an ambulance arrived within minutes. As the paramedics rushed to her aid, Sophia made an important decision. She would not tell anyone the truth, at least not yet. Let Richard believe she was dead. Let him believe he had gotten away with murder. But she would make him pay, in ways he couldn't even imagine. The last thing Sophia remembered before losing consciousness was the paramedic gently asking what had happened. She whispered, "Helicopter accident, the fall and the fight for survival." Sophia awoke in a sterile hospital room, the faint scent of antiseptic mixing with the smell of fresh bandages. Her body ached, every inch of her bruised and broken, but she was alive. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had survived Richard's attempt to kill her. She was awake, and with it came the clear, undeniable knowledge that the war wasn't over. It had only just begun. Her body was wrapped in bandages, her left arm in a cast, ribs taped for support, and countless cuts and bruises on her face. Yet, despite the pain, a small, fierce part of her smiled. Richard thought he had won. He thought he had destroyed her, but she had outlasted him. She had lived through the fall, through the betrayal, through the agony of knowing the man she loved had been plotting her death for months. The nurse who entered the room, Patricia, was kind. Her face held the calm demeanor of someone used to seeing people in distress. But Sophia could tell something was different about her. Patricia spoke in soft tones, reassuring her that everything would be okay, that the doctors had been worried about her chances of survival, but here she was alive. Sophia, despite her injuries, couldn't help but feel the fire of anger burn brighter inside her. The soft words of comfort from Patricia seemed almost foreign to her now. They didn't belong in the world Richard had forced her into. Richard, her husband, had been the one to hurt her, and now he was playing the role of the grieving, worried spouse. He was probably still at the hospital, pretending to be devastated, pretending that his wife's death had been an accident. But Sophia knew better. She wasn't going to let him get away with this, not for one moment longer. As Patricia helped her sit up and drink some water, the questions began to swirl. The nurse mentioned that Richard had already been to visit her every day, that he was distraught and didn't leave her side. But something inside Sophia told her she couldn't trust him, not anymore. Not after everything he had done. Sophia's mind raced. She could still hear Richard's voice, his hollow words, his insincere worry as he told her how much he cared for her while secretly plotting her murder. No, she thought, she couldn't just let it go. She couldn't let him believe she was the weak woman who had fallen prey to his scheme. She had to do something. She had to fight back. As Patricia left the room to attend to other patients, Sophia's eyes wandered around the sterile hospital room. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that in order to bring Richard down, she would need to be smart. She couldn't be impulsive. She had to plan. The first step was simple: keep Richard believing she was dead. Let him think he had won. But that was the beginning of her plan, not the end. Sophia's first decision was not to tell anyone what had truly happened, not yet. She wouldn't speak up until it was the right time, until she had the leverage to bring him down for good. She had learned that she couldn't trust anyone just yet except for herself. As she lay back in her hospital bed, fighting the urge to slip into unconsciousness, she realized something else. She wasn't just playing for revenge. She was playing for her future. She had been trapped in a life of sacrifice, of putting Richard's needs above her own. That life was over. She was going to be someone different, someone strong. And she would not stop until she had turned the tables on him, piece by piece. Sophia's next move was crucial. She needed to disappear completely. She had been planning for a long time, always aware that something wasn't quite right in her marriage, that Richard's behavior had become increasingly erratic and cold. But now she knew she had to take full control of her future. She couldn't do that while tethered to Richard's manipulations. It was time to make the call. When Patricia returned with a new set of bandages, Sophia asked for a moment alone. She was going to call someone she could trust, someone who could help her disappear. Her best friend from nursing school, Nicole, was now a private investigator in Miami. Nicole had always been suspicious of Richard, and Sophia knew she could count on her to help. She dialed Nicole's number, her heart pounding as she waited for the call to connect. "Nicole, it's Sophia," she whispered, her voice shaking with both fear and resolve. "I need your help. Richard tried to kill me. I need to disappear." Nicole's voice was calm but urgent. "Sophia, stay calm. We're going to get you out of there. Just tell me what you need." Sophia explained her situation as quickly as possible, knowing that time was of the essence. Nicole reassured her that she would do whatever it took to help her escape. Sophia felt a small wave of relief wash over her, but it was tempered by the gravity of the situation. She couldn't afford to make mistakes. If Richard realized she was alive, he would surely try to finish what he started. For now, she had to pretend to be the confused, frightened wife, the woman who had narrowly escaped death. But that wouldn't last forever, making the decision to survive or let go. The days following Sophia's phone call with Nicole felt like a blur, a haze of pain and confusion as she lay in the hospital bed, her body slowly healing but her mind sharp as a tack. As the hours passed, she could hear the soft murmurs of hospital staff, the beeping of machines, the occasional footsteps outside her room. But in her mind, all she could focus on was one thing: survival. She had survived the fall. She had survived Richard's attempt to end her life. And now, she had to survive the aftermath. The question of whether or not to go public with the truth gnawed at her. Did she dare tell anyone the truth about what had happened? Did she dare expose her husband's betrayal to the world? Or would it be safer to let everyone think she had died in that horrific accident and disappear, leaving Richard to think he had won? The decision was far from easy. The anger burned deep within her, the betrayal gnawing at her insides. But she knew that if she came out with the truth too soon, if she told the authorities everything right away, she would lose her leverage. Richard had played his cards well. He had covered his tracks, manipulating the insurance companies, erasing evidence, and making sure he had everything he needed to make her death appear like an accident. She wasn't ready to expose herself. She wasn't ready to let him off the hook so easily. No, Sophia knew she needed time. She needed to plan. She needed to be smarter than Richard had given her credit for. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about turning the tables and ensuring that Richard would never have a chance to hurt anyone again. Her decision was made. She would let everyone believe she was dead for now. She would play the part of the confused, grateful wife who had narrowly escaped death, and she would use that facade to her advantage. She would let Richard believe that his plan had worked, that he had gotten away with murder, and in the meantime, she would bide her time. In the quiet of the hospital room, with nothing but the sound of the machines keeping her company, Sophia began to formulate a new identity for herself, one that would be unrecognizable to Richard and the world. She would vanish completely, creating a new life, a new persona. Elena Rodriguez would be born from the ashes of Sophia Martinez, and with this new life, she would make Richard regret every second of the nightmare he had tried to create for her. The next step was clear: get out of the hospital, disappear, and start over. The more she thought about it, the more determined she became. She could no longer afford to be the woman who had loved and trusted Richard. That woman was gone. She had been killed the moment Richard pushed her out of the helicopter. It was time for Elena to take control. Sophia's transformation into Elena began the moment she hung up the phone with Nicole. The private investigator friend she trusted would help her create a new identity, one that would be airtight. New papers, a new address, and a new backstory. She would start fresh, stronger, smarter, and more determined than she had ever been before. Richard had believed he could kill her for money, but he had underestimated her will to survive. And now he was going to pay the price. As she lay in her hospital bed, Sophia thought about all the things she had given up for Richard. She had supported him, helped him through school, and sacrificed her own career dreams for his. She had put her life on hold for him, and for what? So that he could cheat on her, plan her murder, and walk away with millions of dollars. Not anymore. Sophia was done being the passive, trusting wife. It was time for Elena to rise from the ashes and take what was hers. She would rebuild herself emotionally, physically, and financially, and when the time was right, she would make Richard pay for everything he had done. For now, she would continue playing the part. She would pretend to be the woman who was still in shock, still recovering from the trauma of falling from a helicopter. But underneath the surface, Elena was already taking shape, preparing for the battle ahead. It was time to leave the past behind and focus on the future. A future where she was no longer a victim, but a survivor. A future where Richard would be the one who had to look over his shoulder, wondering when his past would catch up with him. Sophia had made her decision. She would survive, and she would make sure that Richard paid for his betrayal in ways he couldn't even imagine. The first steps of revenge, the days in the hospital, began to blend together for Sophia, or rather, for Elena. She had already started her transformation slowly, meticulously. It wasn't just about faking her death anymore. It was about taking back control of her life, her future, and ensuring that Richard would never be able to destroy her again. Each moment she spent recovering from her injuries became a reminder of what she had survived and what was yet to come. Nicole, her best friend and trusted private investigator, was her lifeline. Nicole had already set things in motion, finding a way for Elena to escape the hospital without raising suspicion. A few days after their conversation, Elena was ready to leave. The hospital staff believed she was just a confused, fragile survivor of a tragic accident. But what they didn't know was that Elena was about to disappear from their lives entirely. The plan was simple. Elena would escape under the guise of a medical complication and be whisked away to a safe house. From there, she would begin to put her new life into motion. Her new identity as Elena Rodriguez would be her shield, her weapon, and her armor. No one would know who she truly was, and that was exactly how she needed it to stay for now. When the time came, Nicole helped her orchestrate a smooth escape. The two women used their combined skills to make Elena's departure as seamless as possible. The staff at the hospital would believe that she was simply too fragile to continue her recovery in the hospital, and her absence would only confirm what they had been told, that she had tragically died in the helicopter accident. But in truth, Elena would be living a completely new life. As she sat in the backseat of the car, driving away from the hospital, a deep sense of satisfaction filled her. The weight of the past few days, the pain, the fear, the uncertainty began to lift. For the first time in what felt like years, she could breathe freely. She wasn't just escaping Richard's control, she was reclaiming her life. But the escape was only the beginning. Elena knew that she couldn't just run away, she had to go after Richard. She had to make him feel the same fear she had felt when he had tried to take everything from her. The next step was a game of patience, of carefully plotting her revenge. She needed time to build her new identity, to create the resources that would allow her to bring him down without risking exposure. Once Elena was settled into her new life, the work began. She couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long, but she needed to start gathering information about Richard, about his business dealings, about everything that could be used against him. The first step of her plan was to learn everything about him and the company he worked for, Hartwell Insurance. It was only a matter of time before Richard's greed and his affair with Amanda would catch up with him, and Elena would be the one pulling the strings from the shadows. She started by digging into Richard's financials. She had learned early on that he had been embezzling small amounts from the company for months, but it was the larger, more systematic thefts that would bring him down. Elena was no amateur when it came to money. In her previous life as Sophia, she had worked hard to help Richard climb the corporate ladder, and now that same knowledge would be used against him. She had to uncover everything, every shady deal, every questionable business transaction, and every piece of evidence that could prove he had been stealing from the insurance company he worked for. Through her connections, Elena learned that Hartwell Insurance was struggling to stay afloat. The company was a family-owned business, and Mr. Hartwell, the owner, was nearing retirement. He was looking to sell the company, and Richard had been working hard to ensure that he would be the one to take over. Elena's goal was clear. She would infiltrate the company and use Richard's own ambition against him. The more Elena delved into Richard's professional life, the clearer it became that he was a man driven by greed and ego. He had always believed he could manipulate his way to the top, and now Elena would use that arrogance to her advantage. She began positioning herself as a potential investor in Hartwell Insurance. The company was ripe for acquisition, and Elena knew she could get close to Richard without him suspecting a thing. She would become the person he thought he could trust, all the while setting the stage for his downfall. As she prepared to make her move, Elena couldn't help but think about the past. She thought about the woman she had been, Sofia Martinez, the woman who had been too trusting, too willing to sacrifice her own happiness for the man she loved. That woman had died the moment Richard pushed her from that helicopter. Elena Rodriguez, on the other hand, was born from the ashes of that betrayal, and she was ready to make Richard pay for everything he had done. The days in hiding were long, but they were necessary. Elena knew she had to wait for the right moment to strike. Her patience would pay off, but she had to be careful. She was playing a dangerous game, one that required precision, calculation, and complete control over her emotions. Richard thought he had won, but in truth, he was just a pawn in Elena's larger plan for revenge. Her new life as Elena Rodriguez, Sofia Martinez, was gone. The woman who had trusted, loved, and sacrificed for her husband was no more. In her place stood Elena Rodriguez, a woman of power, purpose, and precision. Elena's transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological, a complete rebirth. Sofia's soft, trusting nature was replaced with a hard, calculating resolve. The fire that had ignited in her when she survived that helicopter fall was now fueling every decision, every move. She was going to take back everything she had lost and make sure Richard paid for everything he had taken from her. In her new life, Elena had no room for mistakes. She was building a foundation that would support her plans for revenge. She had already secured a new identity, one that was airtight. There were no traces of Sofia Martinez left in the world. Elena Rodriguez was a successful real estate investor, a widow whose late husband had left her a significant fortune from his business empire. Her new backstory was simple but powerful. No one would be able to connect her to the woman Richard had tried to murder. Her new life in Miami was luxurious, and she took full advantage of it. Elena rented an upscale apartment, one with stunning views of the city skyline. It was the kind of place that commanded respect, the kind of place she had never been able to afford as Sofia. The apartment was filled with modern furniture, sleek lines, and minimalist decor, nothing extravagant, but everything carefully curated to create an air of sophistication and wealth. She spent her days learning everything she could about business, reading books, attending seminars, and meeting with financial experts. The business world was no stranger to her, but she had never fully embraced it when she was married to Richard. Now, with her new identity, Elena was ready to dive in head first. She used her real estate investments as a stepping stone, quickly building a portfolio of properties across 3 states. The money was pouring in, and the more she earned, the more powerful she became. Elena's success in business came from her intelligence, her ability to read people, and her unrelenting desire for control. She surrounded herself with people who could help her achieve her goals, but she also made sure to keep everyone at arm's length. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, especially with the shadow of Richard hanging over her. But Elena's real goal was not to accumulate wealth, it was to destroy Richard. Every decision, every business move, was part of a larger plan to bring him down. She had to remain focused. She knew she couldn't get too comfortable in her new life. After all, she wasn't just escaping Richard's clutches, she was preparing for the ultimate revenge. She began gathering information on Hartwell Insurance. Elena knew that once she acquired enough knowledge, she could use it to tear Richard apart. The company was on the brink of being sold, and Richard was positioning himself to take control. Elena had to get close, become an insider, and use his own ambition against him. The first step was to buy into the company. Elena wasn't just going to stroll in and announce that she was interested, she had to build trust and gain access to the most valuable information. She started working her way into the company's circle, positioning herself as a potential investor who could help them grow. She made strategic moves to impress the right people and learn as much as she could about Richard's work. At the same time, Elena continued to gather evidence of Richard's wrongdoings. She knew about the embezzlement, but she needed more documents, emails, anything that could be used against him. She was patient, meticulous. Each day brought her closer to the moment when Richard would have nothing left. The more Elena delved into the company, the more she uncovered about Richard's fraudulent activities. He had been manipulating claims and stealing from clients for years, but he was clever. He had covered his tracks well, and it wasn't until Elena began digging that the full extent of his crimes came into view. But there was another side to Richard that Elena had to confront, the personal side. He hadn't just tried to kill her, he had betrayed her in the most intimate way. His affair with Amanda had been going on for months, perhaps longer. Elena couldn't help but feel a surge of bitterness when she thought about it. Amanda, the woman who had helped Richard orchestrate her murder, had been playing the role of the devoted secretary while secretly becoming his lover. It wasn't just the money or the betrayal, it was the way they had both taken everything from her and acted as if she were nothing more than an obstacle in their way. Elena had no intention of letting Amanda get away with it either. She needed to destroy Richard completely, and to do that, she would have to make sure that Amanda's involvement in the embezzlement and the murder plot was exposed. But for now, Elena had to stay focused on the bigger picture. She had to gain Richard's trust again, learn more about his weaknesses, and wait for the right moment to strike. She continued to play the part of the successful widow, maintaining her composure and using her charm to navigate the world of business. She was, after all, playing a a game where she would make Richard and Amanda pay for everything. As Elena walked through her luxurious apartment one evening, gazing out at the city below, she couldn't help but reflect on how far learning about Richard's secrets. Elena's life as a successful businesswoman was falling into place. But the truth remained. Everything she was building, all the wealth and power she had gained, was merely a stepping stone toward one singular goal: Richard's complete destruction. Her patience, though necessary, was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Every day, she forced herself to play the part of the successful investor, the woman who had moved on from the past. But every night, her thoughts returned to the man who had tried to kill her, and how he had hurt her in ways deeper than any physical injury could. As Elena continued her work at Hartwell Insurance, gaining more and more influence in the company, she found herself learning about Richard's personal and professional life in ways she hadn't expected. She had hoped to simply gather the financial records, uncover the fraud, and leave Richard with no choice but to confess. But the deeper she dug, the more disturbing truths surfaced, truths that only made her hatred for him grow. Through her research, Elena learned that Richard's embezzlement wasn't the only illegal activity he had been involved in. His financial dealings extended beyond Hartwell Insurance, and his manipulation wasn't just confined to the workplace. He had been skimming from clients' life insurance payouts for years, using his position at the company to cover up fraudulent claims and pocket the money. The scale of the theft was shocking. But what truly shocked Elena was the discovery that Richard's actions had caused more harm than just financial loss. He had indirectly ruined families, denying rightful beneficiaries of their insurance payouts, all while lining his own pockets. But that was just the beginning. The deeper Elena dug into Richard's personal life, the more disturbing details she found. His affair with Amanda, his secretary, had gone on for much longer than she initially thought. It wasn't just the months leading up to her death, it was years. Amanda had been working with Richard in secret, helping him cover his tracks. Elena had suspected as much, but seeing it laid out in black and white was a whole different level of betrayal. And then there was something even more sinister. Richard had begun to liquidate assets in the months leading up to her supposed death, moving money into accounts that had no direct ties to Hartwell Insurance. It was clear now that Richard had planned to use her death as the final piece of his financial scheme: cash in on her life insurance, take control of her assets, and live comfortably with Amanda. Elena's mind raced as she processed the information. Richard was a man driven by greed, but he was also dangerously confident in his ability to manipulate those around him. He thought that with her gone, he could erase his past mistakes and build a new life for himself. But he had underestimated one very important thing. Elena was alive, and she was now the one holding all the cards. With each piece of new information, Elena's anger only intensified. The man who had been her husband, the one who had vowed to love and protect her, had been nothing more than a predator. A man so consumed by his own desires that he had been willing to murder the woman who had trusted him most. He hadn't just stolen from her, he had stolen from everyone who depended on her, too. But Elena wasn't interested in revenge based solely on his financial crimes. No, the most important piece of this puzzle was the truth behind his betrayal, the attempt on her life. She knew that exposing Richard's fraudulent activities would bring him down professionally, but she needed something more. She needed him to break. She needed him to understand that the woman he had betrayed, the woman he thought he had killed, was coming for him. Elena's plan started to take shape as she pieced together everything she had learned. The information was damning, but she had to be careful. Timing would be everything. Richard's downfall had to be slow and deliberate. She couldn't just walk in and turn him over to the authorities. It wasn't about justice in the traditional sense, it was about making him suffer, making him understand the consequences of underestimating her. She began to plant small seeds of doubt. She subtly manipulated Richard's environment, causing little disruptions at work. She ensured that things started to go wrong in ways that seemed accidental, but were, in fact, orchestrated. Every mistake he made, every slip-up in his work would be another crack in his perfect facade. But it wasn't just about business. Elena knew she had to get to him personally. His relationship with Amanda was unstable, and Elena was about to exploit that. Through careful observation and strategic moves, she started feeding Amanda information that would slowly chip away at the trust between the two of them. The affair had already become a fragile web of lies, and Elena knew exactly how to pull the strings. She started by anonymously sending Amanda photos of Richard with other women, making the affair seem even more complicated. Elena had learned that Amanda was deeply insecure and jealous, and she used that to her advantage. The images, while innocent in context, were designed to plant seeds of doubt. Amanda began questioning Richard's loyalty, and soon the friction between them was palpable. Elena was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The emotional manipulation didn't stop there. Elena knew Amanda's weaknesses, how much she longed for Richard's attention and approval, how desperate she was for him to leave Sophia. Elena made sure Amanda felt neglected, using small details from Richard's life to highlight his disinterest in her. The manipulation was subtle, but it was enough to push Amanda to the brink. Elena's ultimate goal was to break Richard and Amanda completely. She wanted them both to crumble under the weight of their own guilt, jealousy, and deceit. She wanted Richard to feel the full weight of the betrayal he had inflicted on her, and she wanted Amanda to be exposed as the manipulative accomplice she truly was. But even as Elena waged this psychological war, she kept her eyes on the bigger prize. The moment when Richard's entire world would collapse. The moment when he would realize that his past mistakes had caught up with him, and he would have no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. Elena wasn't just going to destroy Richard professionally. The encounter with Richard at Hartwell Insurance. It had been months since Elena's transformation into her new identity, but now the time was nearing for her to come face to face with Richard once again. She had waited patiently, watching him from the shadows, gathering information, manipulating the situation to her advantage. But now, as she prepared to re-enter the world she had once left behind, the tension in her chest was palpable. The time for subtlety was over. She was going to make Richard feel the full force of the consequences of his actions, and it was going to happen on her terms. Elena had carefully orchestrated her reintroduction into the world of Hartwell Insurance. Her role as an investor had been solidified, and with her strategic moves, she was now in a position to meet the people who held power in the company. But more importantly, it would put her in direct contact with Richard. He was still one of the most trusted senior claims adjusters at Hartwell, and Elena knew that if she could gain his trust again, she could use it to her advantage. She entered the company with the poised confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Her tailored suit fit her perfectly, a subtle yet undeniable reflection of her newfound wealth and power. She carried herself like a successful businesswoman because that's exactly what she was. Richard, however, had no idea what was coming for him. The day she was introduced to the company was a whirlwind of handshakes, smiles, and formal introductions. The senior executives of Hartwell seemed eager to meet her, recognizing her as a major investor. They spoke highly of Richard, of his skills as an adjuster, and of the company's continued success under his watch. Elena listened, smiling politely, but her mind was focused on one thing: getting to Richard. It wasn't long before she saw him, a tall figure in a well-tailored suit, confidently speaking with a client in the lobby. He was exactly as she remembered him, the charming, professional man who had once promised her the world, only to shatter it with his betrayal. He was speaking in his usual polished tones, but there was something about him now that was different. He looked tired, worn down, as though the weight of his deceit was starting to show. The moment their eyes met, Elena felt a jolt of recognition. Richard's face shifted from confident composure to a flash of confusion, as if his brain couldn't quite place her. She hadn't changed that much in appearance. Her new identity had been designed to look plausible, but it was the fire in her eyes that was different. It wasn't the same woman he had pushed from the helicopter. This was Elena Rodriguez, smart, sharp, and more powerful than he could ever have imagined. Mrs. Rodriguez, Richard said, extending his hand with a practiced smile. It's a pleasure to meet you again. I believe we've crossed paths before, haven't we? Alina's heart skipped a beat, but she maintained her composure. She stood and extended her hand firmly in return. Yes, I believe we have, she replied, keeping her voice steady and polite. I'm glad we could finally meet in person. Richard's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his usual charm. I didn't realize you were investing in Hartwell. That's great news for the company. Yes, Alina said, her tone casual but with an edge of meaning. I've done some research, and I believe Hartwell has a lot of potential. It's an exciting time. They spoke for a few more minutes, with Richard playing the part of the eager professional claims adjuster. But Alina couldn't help but notice the flicker of discomfort in his eyes, a hint of suspicion that had begun to creep in. He wasn't sure why she seemed so familiar, but Alina knew it wouldn't be long before he realized who she really was. The cracks in his confidence were starting to show, and it was only a matter of time before everything he had worked so hard to build would come crashing down. Alina excused herself from the conversation, but not before making sure Richard had no doubt that she was someone important, someone he would have to reckon with. She walked away, letting him stew in his confusion, savoring the first small taste of what was to come. She knew this was just the beginning. Her next steps would be calculated and precise. She would slowly infiltrate Richard's life, learn his weaknesses, and use them against him. But for now, she had planted the seed. Richard would never look at her the same way again. And when the time came, Alina would strike when he least expected it. As she left Hartwell for the day, Alina couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. She had finally put herself in the position she needed to be in. Richard had unknowingly just entered a new phase, wreaking havoc in Richard's personal life. The psychological battle had begun. Alina knew that to bring Richard down completely, she would need to strike at the heart of what he valued most, his personal life. Richard had been so sure of himself, so convinced, that he could manipulate and control everyone around him without consequences. But Alina had learned from the past. She had learned how to survive his manipulation. And now, she was going to use the same tactics to make him feel the same powerlessness she had felt in the moments before she was pushed from that helicopter. Her first move was to target Amanda. The affair between Richard and his secretary had been ongoing for years, and while Richard was too arrogant to see it, Alina knew exactly how to exploit it. Amanda had always been insecure, desperate for Richard's attention and approval. Alina understood this well. She, too, had once been the woman who loved and trusted Richard without question. But now she would use Amanda's own fears and insecurities against her. Alina started small. She anonymously sent Amanda pictures of Richard with other women, making sure the photos were cropped just right to imply something far more intimate than was true. She added captions that suggested a deeper connection, planting seeds of doubt in Amanda's mind. The affair between Richard and Amanda had always been fragile, based on lies and manipulation. Alina knew that if she pushed the right buttons, she could break their relationship apart. As expected, Amanda became paranoid. The pictures and the anonymous messages stirred something inside her, a growing fear that she might lose Richard, the very man she had fought so hard to win. Alina watched from the sidelines as Amanda began questioning Richard, confronting him about his other relationships. The stress between them grew, and it didn't take long before Richard's calm facade cracked. Alina knew exactly when the moment had arrived, the moment when he would start feeling the weight of his own lies. One afternoon, Alina followed Richard and Amanda to a small cafe where they often met for lunch. The couple seemed tense, their conversation strained. Alina sat at a nearby table, watching carefully. As she sipped her coffee, she overheard bits of their heated conversation. Amanda's voice rose, demanding answers from Richard, accusing him of betraying her with other women. Richard, looking frustrated, tried to calm her down, but Alina could see the cracks in his armor. His usual confidence was replaced with defensive guilt. "I'm not doing this with you again, Amanda," Richard said, his voice low. "You know how things are. Stop reading into everything." But Amanda wasn't backing down. "I saw the photos, Richard. Who are they? Why are you meeting them behind my back? Do you still love me, or am I just someone to pass the time with?" Alina couldn't help but smile as she listened to their exchange. This was exactly what she had hoped for. Amanda's jealousy and insecurity were taking over, causing her to lash out at Richard. The relationship between them, once built on manipulation, was crumbling, but Alina wasn't finished yet. She knew that to truly break Richard, she needed to make him doubt everything. She started planting subtle but effective lies, feeding Amanda small tidbits of information that would make her question Richard's loyalty. Alina knew Amanda would be too emotionally invested to see the truth, that she was being manipulated as much as Richard had once manipulated Alina. The emotional manipulation was working perfectly. Amanda confronted Richard multiple times over the next few weeks, demanding to know if he was seeing someone else. Each argument escalated until, one day, Alina received the phone call she had been waiting for. Amanda had finally cracked. In a fit of rage, she called Richard out, accusing him of trying to replace her with someone else, someone better, someone younger. Alina had anticipated this moment, and it was time to strike. She began sending anonymous emails to Amanda, revealing more details about Richard's financial misconduct at Hartwell Insurance. She included snippets of emails that made it appear as though Richard had been embezzling funds and using his position to manipulate clients. Amanda's mind, already clouded by doubt, began to spiral. The lies, the financial scandals, and the emotional manipulation all blended together in a perfect storm of betrayal. At the same time, Alina made sure that Richard's work performance began to slip. She subtly sabotaged his efforts by altering reports and creating small mistakes in the documents he submitted. The slow decline of his work became increasingly evident to his superiors. The more mistakes he made, the more Richard's stress mounted, and Alina could see the toll it was taking on him. He was unraveling just as she had planned. The chaos in Richard's personal life mirrored the chaos in his professional life. The more Alina made him doubt everything he had worked for, the more control she gained. She had turned his world upside down without ever directly confronting him. Richard had no idea that the woman he had tried to kill had returned not just to take back her life, but to make him pay for every moment of pain and deceit he had caused her. Alina wasn't done yet. She continued to manipulate the situation, ensuring that Richard's relationship with Amanda became more volatile. The strain was beginning to show in every interaction. Richard's once carefully constructed world of control and manipulation was crumbling, and all Alina had to do was watch. She knew that soon, the walls would come crashing down, and when they did, Richard would have no one left to blame but himself. As Alina sat back and watched, she felt the satisfaction of knowing that her plan was working. Richard had underestimated her, thinking that he could dispose of her like an old possession. But Alina was no longer the woman. The Professional Sabotage, Part 1. Alina's plan was taking shape perfectly, but she knew that to completely destroy Richard, she needed to go beyond emotional manipulation. She had already unraveled his personal life, exploited Amanda's insecurities, and turned his professional life upside down. But that wasn't enough. The real power was in his career. His job at Hartwell Insurance was his pride and joy, and losing it would be the final blow. Richard had built his entire world around his success in the insurance industry, and Alina intended to watch it collapse in front of him. At the heart of her strategy was subtle sabotage. Alina knew that Richard, with his inflated sense of self-importance, wouldn't notice the small mistakes at first. She began planting errors in his work, deliberately altering the files he was responsible for, making sure the discrepancies were not immediately obvious but would build up over time. She made sure to target reports and claims he was managing directly. Each small, seemingly inconsequential change would set off a chain reaction, creating problems that would snowball out of his control. She also knew that Hartwell's management team relied heavily on Richard's reports to make critical business decisions. If those reports started to show discrepancies or errors, it would eventually raise alarms. Alina had a keen understanding of how businesses operated, having worked in finance for years under the guise of her previous identity. She was playing the long game, letting Richard's work degrade slowly, so it would appear like he was slipping without him realizing it. By the time he noticed, it would be too late. The first significant mistake she planted was in a high-profile claim he was handling for a major client. She adjusted the settlement numbers, making them higher than they should have been. The next day, Richard presented the case to the management team, and everything seemed to go smoothly. But Alina knew that it was only a matter of time before someone in the company would notice the irregularities. Sure enough, within a week, the discrepancies started to surface. The client, whose claim had been improperly adjusted, contacted the company asking why they had received more than they were entitled to. This, of course, triggered an internal audit, but it didn't stop there. Other small errors began to surface as well. Richard's previously impeccable reputation started to show signs of wear. The management team at Hartwell Insurance was quick to take notice. Richard had always been seen as the reliable one, the one who kept things running smoothly. But Alina's sabotage had begun to crack that facade. He was now under scrutiny, and Alina could see that the tension was growing. Richard was used to being in control, but now he was slipping, and the more mistakes he made, the more the cracks in his armor grew. The pressure was building, and it wouldn't be long before it broke him. While Richard's professional life began to crumble, Alina made sure to keep the pressure on his personal life as well. She continued to feed Amanda information about Richard's supposed infidelity, subtly reinforcing Amanda's jealousy. The emotional chaos between them grew, as did the strain on Richard's work. Every small fight with Amanda bled into his professional performance, making it easier for Alina to manipulate his downfall. But Alina's plan was far from over. She wasn't just waiting for Richard to fail, she was making sure that everything in his world would collapse simultaneously. The next step in her strategy was to make sure the management at Hartwell started questioning Richard's ability to lead. His credibility was everything to him, and once it was gone, so was his power. One evening, as Richard was working late at the office, Alina sent an anonymous email to Mr. Hartwell, the owner of Hartwell Insurance. She didn't make any direct accusations, but she made sure to subtly suggest that Richard's recent work was raising questions. She included some of the reports that Alina had tampered with, all while hiding her tracks perfectly. The email was innocuous enough, but its implications were clear. The following morning, Mr. Hartwell called Richard into his office for a meeting. Alina, watching from a distance, couldn't help but smile. The trap was set. Richard was about to be confronted with the first signs of his professional destruction. It didn't take long for Richard to realize that something was wrong. Mr. Hartwell had always been the type of boss who gave his employees the benefit of the doubt, but the errors were too much to ignore. Richard tried to explain himself, offering excuses and shifting blame, but Alina knew the management team wasn't going to let it slide for long. This was just the beginning. Richard's job, his reputation, his entire world was starting to crumble. And Alina was behind it all, orchestrating every move with precision and patience. As she watched Richard enter Mr. Hartwell's office, Alina felt a sense of satisfaction. She had set the wheels in motion, and now it was only a matter of time before Richard realized that everything he had built was slipping through his fingers. He thought he had outsmarted her, thought he had killed her and taken everything. But Alina had risen from the ashes, and now Richard's descent into paranoia. As the weeks passed, Richard's professional world began to unravel in ways he could neither explain nor control. The errors in his reports, the mounting pressure from management, and the growing suspicion that something was deeply wrong at Hartwell Insurance began to take its toll. Richard, a man who had once prided himself on his sharp mind and impeccable reputation, was now stumbling from one crisis to another. The cracks in his facade started to widen. He had always believed he could manipulate any situation to his advantage, but the subtle sabotage Alina had orchestrated was too intricate for him to comprehend. Every mistake he made seemed to lead to more problems, each one building upon the last. The errors in the claims, the shady financial dealings, and the mounting complaints from clients and coworkers were starting to paint a picture no one at Hartwell could ignore. But it wasn't just his work that was crumbling. Alina's manipulation of his personal life had begun to push Richard toward the edge. His once solid relationship with Amanda had become a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. The more Alina fueled Amanda's insecurities, the more paranoid Richard became. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He couldn't trust anyone anymore, not even Amanda, who had once been his confidant and lover. One afternoon, after a particularly heated argument with Amanda, Richard sat in his office, staring at the documents in front of him. He had become obsessed with the idea that someone was sabotaging him. He didn't know who, but he was sure someone had been planting these mistakes, altering his reports, making him look incompetent. He could feel the pressure mounting. He wasn't just under the scrutiny of his boss, he was now paranoid, constantly questioning those around him. Was Amanda behind it? Had one of his coworkers turned on him? Or was someone else, someone he had once trusted, pulling the strings from the shadows? Alina was watching, of course. She knew that Richard's growing paranoia was a crucial part of her plan. She had always known that Richard's biggest weakness was his inability to trust others. He had built his world on manipulation and control, and now that control was slipping from his grasp. Alina made sure to feed into his paranoia, letting him believe that everyone around him was conspiring against him. She knew that if she kept him distracted with his own fear, he would make more mistakes, more missteps, until it was too late for him to recover. But even Alina couldn't have predicted how far Richard's paranoia would go. One day, after a particularly tense meeting with Mr. Hartwell, Richard snapped. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that every move he made was being scrutinized. He began to suspect that someone within the company was setting him up, and that thought alone pushed him to a breaking point. He started to act erratically, withdrawing from his coworkers, becoming defensive and paranoid. His once polished demeanor began to crack, revealing a man consumed by fear and distrust. He started questioning his employees, demanding answers from people who had once been his closest allies. His once impeccable work ethic became erratic, and his focus wavered. The very things that had made him successful were now his undoing. Alina knew that it was only a matter of time before Richard would make a critical mistake. His paranoia would lead him to act impulsively, and when he did, he would expose himself for the fraud and criminal he was. The more Richard spiraled, the more Alina's plan was working. She wasn't just tearing down his career. She was breaking his spirit, making him question everything he had once held dear. The final act of sabotage came when Richard, overwhelmed by his fears, made a desperate attempt to cover up his mistakes. He began altering documents even more blatantly, trying to erase the evidence of his wrongdoings. But Alina was one step ahead. She had already planted a backup of everything, ready to expose him at the right moment. The moment he made his final misstep, she would be there to ensure that he had no way out. Meanwhile, Amanda's role in all of this continued to disintegrate. Alina made sure that Amanda's doubts about Richard's loyalty grew with every passing day. The lies, the photos, the whispered accusations. Alina had carefully orchestrated everything to make sure Amanda would eventually turn on Richard. Alina's goal was clear. Destroy Richard both professionally and personally, make him lose everything, and then expose him for what he truly was. One day, after a particularly heated argument between Amanda and Richard, Alina's plan reached its climax. Amanda, pushed to the breaking point, finally confronted Richard with the truth. "You've been lying to me this whole time, Richard," she said, her voice shaking with anger and betrayal. "You never really cared about me. You used me to get rid of your wife, and now you're trying to play both sides. I know about the embezzling, I know about the lies, and I'm not going down with you." The confrontation was everything Alina had hoped for. Richard's world was collapsing, his lies being exposed in front of the one person he had trusted the most. And now, the last piece of Alina's revenge was set into motion. Alina made sure she was there, watching from a distance, as Richard tried to defend himself. But there was no way to explain away the truth. He had pushed his wife out of a helicopter, he had stolen from his clients and coworkers, and now he was about to lose everything. In the midst of the chaos, Alina called the authorities and made an anonymous tip about Richard's financial crimes. She provided the evidence she had gathered over the months, knowing that the police would be able to trace the embezzlement back to him. Richard had no idea that everything he had done to cover his tracks had been meticulously documented, and that his fall from grace would be as public as it was inevitable. As she watched the scene unfold from her hidden vantage point, Alina felt a deep Richard's final fall. The storm had arrived, and Richard was caught in its fury. The moment he walked into Mr. Hartwell's office, looking pale and disoriented, he knew it was over. He had tried every trick, every excuse, every apology, but nothing could erase the mounting evidence against him. The moment Mr. Hartwell began listing the numerous discrepancies in his work, discrepancies Alina had meticulously orchestrated, Richard knew there was no escape. He had been caught, and there was no way out. Mr. Hartwell's face was grim as he looked up from the pile of evidence on his desk. "Richard, I don't know how you thought you could get away with this," he said quietly, his disappointment clear in his voice. "You've been stealing from us. You've been manipulating our clients, and now you've jeopardized the future of this company." Richard's mind raced, but the reality was sinking in. He had been too arrogant, too blinded by his own ambition to see the walls closing in around him. The lies, the thefts, the affair with Amanda, it had all culminated in this moment. He tried to defend himself, to explain away the fraud, but nothing he said mattered anymore. The evidence was undeniable. "I didn't do this alone," Richard finally muttered, his voice breaking. "Amanda, she helped me. She knew about everything. The confession came too late. Mr. Hartwell's expression hardened. "Richard, you're fired. We'll be contacting the authorities. You're not just fired, you're going to be investigated, and we'll make sure you face the consequences of your actions." Richard felt his heart sink as the weight of his situation hit him. His entire career, everything he had worked for, was slipping away in a matter of minutes. He had always thought he could control everything, that he could manipulate his way to the top. But now it was all falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Elena, of course, had been watching from a distance. She had ensured that Richard's downfall would be as public as possible. She knew that once the authorities got involved, there would be no turning back. Richard would be arrested for his embezzlement, his affair with Amanda would be exposed, and his reputation, what little of it remained, would be destroyed. His life as he had known it was over. But Elena didn't feel the satisfaction she thought she would. She had planned this for months, carefully manipulating Richard's every move, and now that it was happening, it felt anticlimactic. Richard's fall from grace was so complete, so inevitable, that there was no thrill in watching him break. She had already won, but there was no joy in the victory. Instead, there was only a sense of finality. She had planned this revenge for so long, and now that it was done, she couldn't help but reflect on everything she had lost in the process. Her marriage to Richard, the dreams she had put aside for him, the life she had once believed in, it had all been shattered. And yet, despite everything, she had rebuilt herself. She had become stronger, more resourceful, and more ruthless than she had ever imagined. Elena had survived when Richard thought he had killed her, and she had emerged from the ashes to destroy him completely. As Richard left the office, escorted by security, his world crumbling around him, Elena couldn't help but think back to the woman she had been before all of this, the woman who had trusted too easily, loved too deeply, and sacrificed too much. That woman was dead, and in her place stood a woman who had learned how to fight back, a woman who had taken back control of her life. But there was no time for self-reflection now. Elena still had one last task to complete. She needed to ensure that Amanda faced the same consequences as Richard. Elena had already prepared the final blow. She had collected enough evidence to expose Amanda's role in the embezzlement and the murder plot. All it took now was a phone call. Later that evening, Elena called the police and provided them with the last pieces of the puzzle. She made sure they had all the information they needed to link Amanda to Richard's crimes. Elena didn't care about the details. All she cared about was making sure that Amanda would pay for what she had done. The woman who had been part of Richard's plan to kill her would face the same fate. Elena wasn't going to let her escape, not after everything she had been through. The police were quick to act. They arrested Amanda, and when the evidence against her came to light, it was clear that she had been just as involved in the fraud and the murder plot as Richard. The affair, the manipulation, the theft, it was all exposed. Amanda's life, too, was destroyed. With both Richard and Amanda facing criminal charges, Elena knew that her revenge was complete. The people who had tried to destroy her, who had conspired to kill her for money, had paid the price for their actions. Richard had lost everything: his job, his money, his reputation, and his freedom. Amanda, too, was left with nothing. They had underestimated her, and now they were both facing the consequences. Elena had become a force to be reckoned with, a woman who had clawed her way back from the brink of death and risen stronger than ever before. Her life was no longer defined by her marriage to Richard or the trauma he had caused her. She had created a new life, one that was entirely her own, a life built on strength, intelligence, and resilience. As she sat in her penthouse that evening, looking out at the city skyline, Elena felt a strange sense of peace. The aftermath, rebuilding her life. Elena sat quietly in her penthouse, the weight of her triumph slowly sinking in. The menacing shadows of her past had finally receded, and she could now look toward the future. It had been a long and painful journey, but as she looked out at the city lights twinkling below, a sense of freedom washed over her. She was no longer a victim of Richard's manipulation. She was no longer a woman defined by her past. Elena Rodriguez had emerged from the wreckage of her former life as something new, stronger, smarter, and unshakable. The court trials had been swift. Richard and Amanda both pleaded guilty to their crimes, and the legal consequences were inevitable. Richard was sentenced to years in prison for embezzlement, fraud, and the attempted murder of his wife. Amanda, too, was facing time behind bars for her role in the plot. Both of them were broken, no longer the powerful figures they had once been, but shadows of their former selves. As Elena watched the news coverage of their arrests and convictions, she felt a strange detachment. It wasn't satisfaction that she felt, it was more of a quiet acceptance. She had orchestrated this downfall, but now that it had been completed, there was no joy in seeing them fall. In truth, the most satisfying part of this journey had been the reclaiming of her own life. The vengeance, the justice, it had been necessary, but it had been just a means to an end. Her thoughts shifted to what came next. Alina had built an empire from the ashes of her broken marriage. She had invested wisely, built an incredible portfolio of real estate, and even expanded into medical and tech industries. She had hired the best people to help her run the business, and she was no longer just an investor, she was a force in the business world. Alina Rodriguez had become synonymous with success. She had no intention of stopping. In fact, she saw this as just the beginning of her new life. But Alina wasn't just a businesswoman. She had a deeper purpose. Through everything she had been through, one thing had become abundantly clear: she wanted to help others, especially women who had suffered at the hands of abusive partners. In memory of her former self, Sofia Martinez, Alina founded a charitable foundation dedicated to helping women escape domestic violence. She used her vast resources to provide shelter, financial assistance, and legal support to victims who needed a way out. The foundation was growing quickly, and Alina was involved in every aspect of it, from fundraising to direct support. In this new chapter of her life, Alina realized that the power she had gained was not just for her own benefit. She could use it to change the world for the better, to create a legacy that would outlast any personal vendetta. Helping other women escape situations like her own felt like the final piece of the puzzle, a way to give back, to redeem the years she had lost to Richard's control, and to ensure that other women wouldn't have to endure the same fate. But her transformation wasn't just about business and philanthropy. Alina had rebuilt herself physically as well. She had hired personal trainers, nutritionists, and even martial arts instructors to regain control over her body and mind. Her confidence had grown with every achievement, every step she took toward regaining what had been taken from her. The woman who had once been a victim was now a symbol of strength, resilience, and unwavering determination. In a way, Alina had become a legend, a woman who survived the unthinkable, who fought back and came out on top. People admired her, not just for her wealth and business acumen, but for her resilience, her ability to overcome the darkest moments and emerge victorious. She was the embodiment of strength physically, emotionally, and mentally. As the years went by, Alina's empire expanded further. She made strategic investments in sustainable energy, technology, and healthcare. She was involved in global initiatives aimed at improving women's rights and empowering marginalized communities. Alina had transformed from a woman seeking vengeance to a philanthropist with a vision for a better future. Her life had come full circle. From the woman who had been pushed out of a helicopter to the woman who now controlled vast resources, Alina had proven that she was unstoppable. The fall from the helicopter had been the catalyst for her transformation, but it was the strength she discovered within herself that had truly driven her success. Alina knew that the future held endless possibilities. She had learned from the pain, the loss, and the betrayal, and now she had the power to shape the world in her image. She would never forget Sofia Martinez, the woman who had been betrayed, the woman who had loved unconditionally, but she had long since moved beyond that identity. Alina Rodriguez was a force, and she would not be stopped. As she looked out at the city once more, Alina smiled. The woman she had been was gone, and the woman she had become was stronger than anyone could have imagined. Richard's betrayal had been the spark, but Alina had become the fire that had consumed everything in its path. She had everything she had ever wanted: freedom, power, respect, and the return of the past, unanswered questions. Although Alina had achieved so much in her new life, she had never been able to fully close the door on her past. Richard's betrayal, the physical and emotional scars, and the manipulations he had subjected her to, all of it was still a part of her. In quiet moments, when she was alone in her penthouse, Alina sometimes found herself reflecting on the life she had left behind. It wasn't just the man who had pushed her out of the helicopter. It was everything: the trust she had given, the sacrifices she had made, and the life she had once thought would be hers forever. Alina had done her best to bury these feelings. She had focused on her businesses, her foundation, and the new identity she had built from the ashes of Sofia Martinez. Yet, as her success grew, so did the questions. Questions about what would have happened had she never met Richard, had she never been deceived, had she never lost herself in the dark maze of her past. One day, as Alina walked through the busy streets of Miami, a strange feeling overcame her. She was on her way to meet with a potential investor, someone who could help her expand her foundation even further. But the familiar tightness in her chest began to form. It had been years since she had thought about Richard, but the thought of the man who had tried to destroy her surfaced with an intensity she hadn't expected. Was this the price of freedom, having to constantly carry the weight of the past, even when you had moved on? Her thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Usually, Alina didn't answer unfamiliar numbers, but something made her pick up the phone. "Hello," she answered. A low voice responded. "Is this Alina Rodriguez?" "Yes," she replied, sensing that something wasn't quite right. "This is Detective Sarah Chin. I'm with the Miami Police Department." Alina felt a chill creep down her spine. "Detective Chin, how can I help you?" The detective paused for a moment before speaking. "I'm afraid we need to discuss something that's been brought to our attention. We've recently uncovered some new evidence related to the case of Richard Martinez and his disappearance." Alina's heart skipped a beat. It had been years since Richard had been arrested and sentenced to prison, but something in her gut told her that this wasn't going to be a routine inquiry. "We've discovered that Richard may not be in the location we initially thought he was," Detective Chin continued. "We believe he may have escaped and is now living under a different identity. There are several inconsistencies in his prison records that we're investigating." Alina's breath caught in her throat. She had been so focused on her own life, on her revenge, and on building her future that she hadn't considered that Richard might somehow manage to escape. The thought that he could still be out there, watching her every move, was terrifying. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I need your help," the detective said, breaking Alina's thoughts. "We believe you may have information that could help us track Richard down. We know you were once married to him, and there may be things you know that could help." Alina was silent for a moment, her mind racing. She had no idea what Richard might have done or where he could be. She had assumed he would rot in prison, forgotten by everyone, just another criminal paying for his sins. But now, it seemed that the past had come knocking on her door again. "Detective, what do you need from me?" Alina asked, her voice steady but her heart racing. "We just need to know if you've heard anything about Richard's whereabouts, or if he had any connections that might help him escape. Any details, no matter how small, could be crucial." Alina's mind flicked through the years of betrayal, the days she spent piecing together the wreckage of her marriage. Richard had always been clever, manipulative. But the idea that he could have escaped, that he might be watching her now, was a haunting thought. "I'll help," Alina said, her voice firm, "but I need to be clear. I've moved on from him. I have a new life now, and I'm not interested in the past. If Richard is involved in anything illegal, he'll be the one to pay the price, not me." The detective acknowledged her words, though Alina could hear the skepticism in her tone. "Understood. But please, if you recall any details about his contacts, the way he might have planned his escape, please let us know. We don't want him to hurt anyone else." Alina's mind was spinning. The past she had so carefully buried was now resurfacing. Richard was out there, a ghost haunting her future. She knew she couldn't let this go. She had worked too hard to build her new life, and the thought of him returning to disrupt everything was too much to bear. As the phone call ended, Alina felt a surge of determination rise in her chest. She would not let Richard destroy her again. She had come too far, and she had too much to lose. She had rebuilt herself from nothing, and now it seemed that fate was testing her resolve once more. She would find Richard, confront him if necessary, and ensure that he would never be a threat to her or anyone else again. He thought he had escaped justice, but Alina knew that no one ever truly escapes their past, not when someone like her is involved. Alina turned toward her office building, her mind already formulating her next steps. She had to be smart, precise. She couldn't afford any mistakes. Richard had been a powerful force in her life once, but he wouldn't be that again. This time it was Alina's turn to win. Confronting the past once more, Alina's world had shifted once again, like the sudden gust of wind that blows across a calm sea, turning everything upside down. The past, which she had painstakingly buried and moved beyond, was now creeping into her present. Richard's possible escape from prison was the last thing she expected to face after all these years. She had worked so hard to distance herself from that life, and yet here it was unavoidable, persistent, and real. In the days following the phone call from Detective Chin, Alina couldn't stop thinking about Richard. His escape was the kind of twist in her story she had never anticipated. She had assumed that after he'd been convicted and sent away, her life would finally be hers to control, free from his toxic presence. But the possibility that he could be out there, somewhere, lurking in the shadows of her new world, was a chilling thought. Alina spent the next few days researching everything she could about Richard's escape. She knew from experience that the police were likely following every lead, but she didn't trust them to be thorough. She had learned to rely on herself after everything she'd been through. It was time to get her hands dirty once again, to play the game on her own terms. She started by contacting her most trusted allies, Nicole, her old friend and private investigator, who had helped her disappear years ago. Nicole had connections, expertise, and a level of dedication that Alina knew would be invaluable. When Alina explained the situation, Nicole's response was immediate. "I'll get started on this right away," Nicole said. "If he's out there, we'll find him. We'll track every lead and turn over every stone." Alina felt a weight lift off her shoulders, knowing Nicole was in her corner. She had built her empire with determination and perseverance, but even she knew she couldn't handle this on her own. The search for Richard wasn't just about finding him, it was about ensuring he couldn't hurt her again. It was about eliminating the last trace of him from her life. But as Alina continued to dig into Richard's past and his potential escape, a gnawing feeling began to creep in. What if Richard had already planned his revenge? What if he was coming for her now, targeting the one thing she had worked so hard to build? It was a possibility she couldn't afford to ignore. Alina took precautions. She hired additional security for her penthouse and increased the security measures at her business locations. No stone would be left unturned. She couldn't afford to let Richard have any advantage, even if it meant sacrificing some of the life she had fought so hard to build. The following week, Alina received an update from Nicole. She had traced Richard's movements to a small town in Oregon. He had been living under a new name, and his trail had been cold for a while, but it was clear now that Richard was trying to lay low, likely waiting for the perfect opportunity to resurface. With the new lead in hand, Alina knew what had to be done. She couldn't allow Richard to regain his confidence, thinking he had evaded justice. He needed to understand, once and for all, that Alina Rodriguez was no longer the woman he could manipulate, control, or destroy. She would be the one to decide when his game was over. But there was still one more step before she could confront him. Alina knew Richard was desperate, and with desperation came mistakes. She had to wait for him to slip just enough for her to catch him. Days turned into weeks as Alina prepared for the final confrontation. During this time, she strengthened her resolve. The past that Richard had tried to shatter had shaped her into the woman she had become: independent, powerful, and unstoppable. Richard's return wouldn't be a symbol of his triumph. It would be the last chapter of his downfall. Finally, Alina received the news she had been waiting for. Richard was spotted at a local bar in the town of Larchwood, Oregon. He had been seen interacting with a small group of people, one of whom was an old associate from his time before prison. It was clear now that Richard wasn't hiding as well as he thought he was. His desire to reconnect with his past had put him in the open, and Alina was ready to capitalize on it. The confrontation had to be swift, controlled. Alina couldn't let emotions cloud her judgment. She wasn't seeking revenge in the traditional sense. She was making sure that Richard would never threaten her or anyone else again. She wasn't going to let him destroy another person's life, and she wasn't going to let him believe for even a second that he had won. Alina made the decision to confront him herself. She wasn't afraid anymore. The fear she had once carried, the doubt and the hurt, had long since faded. She had moved past all of that. This time, when she faced Richard, she would not be the frightened woman who had fallen from the helicopter. This time, she would be the woman who stood tall, the woman who had survived it all and was now stronger than anyone could have imagined. As she made her way to Larchwood, Alina's thoughts were clear and focused. This was her final